Like many corporate free candidates, Carlos Ovalle was attacked by the Democratic Party in his bid for Long Beach City Council. But Ovalle is not giving up his fight. Here, at the California National Party Convention, Ovalle shared some of his life story, his experiences as a grassroots candidate, and his hopes for the future.
So again, my name is Carlos Ovalle. I am an architect and a community advocate. I'm not new to politics. I grew up in politics. In fact, I grew up in Guatemala in conditions of almost continuous civil war and repression. A country that was governed by, and still is to an extent, by Washington, D.C. So whenever we had any semblance of democracy arising, people's choice, it would get squashed. Here, things get squashed in a different way. Over there, they literally get squashed. My dad was one of these people who were very vocal against the government. And he did that contrary to advice and the pleadings of his friends and family and my mom. And as a result of that, there were a couple of attempts on his life. The first time they ran him over in a car. The next time they attempted to behead him, he managed to survive with severe injuries. But as a result of that, our family ended up emigrating to the U.S. on an emergency visa. So, I was forced to grow up very fast. As a 9-year-old, I had to help nurse my dad back to health while watching my younger brothers, and my mom had to go to work to make a living. So eventually we came here. We settled in Wilmington, which a part of Wilmington that eventually got incorporated into the city of Carson. We learned English by immersion, all of us. My school didn't have a single Spanish speaker. So it was difficult in terms of language. It was also difficult in terms of culture and discrimination that most immigrants face. On our way here, we actually drove through. We took the long way. We drove through El Paso, and this is a story that you've probably heard before. It's very common among immigrants who travel through Texas, and we stopped by a convenience store that had a sign that said "No Mexicans or dogs allowed." So I had to go back and ask my dad what that meant, and it didn't look good. But at that point, I kind of began to understand what discrimination means. Obviously, that continued while I was here, but it continues to this day. It's very subtle for people who are Anglo and native English speakers have a difficult time understanding it, but it does exist. So anyway, I realized I was a socialist from a very early age. Socialists were the only ones that paid attention to my family when we first emigrated here. They understood, and my dad understood the class nature of society. And so I grew up around books by Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and other stuff. But I was never really, deeply involved in politics. In fact, not at all. I had never belonged to a party. When I became a citizen and I started to vote, I having that background of growing up in a socialist household led me to kind of see through all the bullshit. Can I say that here?
Yes.
And so I didn't belong to any party. I was always no party preference. At the same time, I didn't have the discipline to belong to a socialist party. Party discipline is something that, or any kind of discipline at home. Anyway, so always a rebel. But I did do things that, everything I did was geared towards my deep beliefs. And so as an architect, I'm an architect. As an architect, I started, my first job was designing homes for veterans that were financed by FHA. And I've continued to design affordable housing up until very recently. I retired as of yesterday. I participated in many nonprofits. I designed homeless shelters, shelters for victims of domestic violence, and all sorts of other things that were not very, they didn't make me rich, as opposed to some of my other classmates who designed, luxury stuff. But anyway, it's what made me happy. Eventually, that led me to Nicaragua. I was always paying attention to the plight of countries that were suffering the fate that my country suffered in its civil war. And so at some point I decided to go to Nicaragua and volunteer my time. I had a little bit of military training, and so I thought, okay, the Contra War is in full swing. I wanted the government of Nicaragua to hand me an AK-47, and I wanted to go to the front lines. Idealist, young revolutionary. Instead, they found out that I was an architect and that I was fully bilingual. And so the government of Nicaragua assigned me the role of being a translator for one of the ministers, and they also gave me a full-time job as an architect, because all the architects had fled the revolution and went to where the money was. That's my profession. It's, next to prostitution, it's the oldest profession, but we're all prostitutes in that sense. We go where the money is. So I stayed in Nicaragua for a little over a year, working as an architect, as a translator, and as a bicycle mechanic, my other passion. And it was very eye-opening. I got into trouble with the Sandinista government because they had a belief in a mixed economy. They felt that having cooperatives, much as the previous speaker was talking about, was the solution. And I thought, no, you have to go all out and do a socialist revolution and be like Cuba. And so that got me in trouble with the Sandinistas, and they actually threw me in jail for a day. But it was all good. In the end, after that time, I came back. I wasn't making any money, and I had student loans to pay. And while I was there, I got married, and my salary in Nicaragua was $35 a month, which is if in the late '80s. Even in a country where things were heavily subsidized, that was poverty wages. But anyway, came back and continued doing what I did before, architecture for the public good, and still paying attention to world politics, and at some point I kind of got burned out with world politics, the sort of the bigger, issues, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Iran, and all, and Latin America, and then I started to pay a little closer attention to home, Long Beach. After living in Wilmington for a couple of years, we moved to Long Beach, and I've lived in the same neighborhood with little breaks here and there. And so it caught my attention that one day Mayor Garcia, our mayor, soon to be congressman in, what is it, the 42nd district? He proposed to increase term limits from 2 terms to 3 terms. And the way he worded it was very deceptive. He called it strengthening term limits, which is a term that has been borrowed by other cities. What was that city that just recently increased term limits?
Linwood.
Linwood. Okay, so Linwood increased their term limit, and they used exactly the same model. I'm sure they consulted with him. Strengthening term limits. How does, if you have a nation of, what do we have, 300 million people? And if we're able to run it with 2 terms, why do we need 3 terms for a city of less than 500,000 people? It was bizarre. It seemed very authoritarian, and having come from experience with authoritarian countries, it didn't smell good to me. So I launched a petition, which was unsuccessful, but it did draw the attention of Mayor Garcia, who asked to meet with me and my brother, who was helping me with that petition. He met at our home, and when it became apparent that we were not buying his bullshit, he attempted to bribe us. He offered us seats in his commissions in exchange for dropping our opposition to his term limit extension. It wasn't just that. There were also a few other measures that he was proposing at the same time. In order to curtail opposition, he also violated the Brown Act and the First Amendment by limiting our speaking time. So in the required hearings, we were only given 36 seconds to speak in opposition to each one of those items. 36 seconds is nothing. You basically introduce yourself and that's it. So it became very, very apparent that Garcia was an authoritarian, and I'm sure he's going to continue that once he makes it to Congress, if he does. Hopefully not, but that's kind of how it's looking. But it wasn't just him, it was the entire city government. And keep in mind that most of the city government in Long Beach is progressive Democrats, darlings of the Democratic Party and of the squad and all that kind of stuff. So it became very apparent that it's not just Mayor Garcia, it's not just our council members, it's the whole Democratic Party. Obviously, the Republican Party has the same sort of issues with their sphere of influence, but basically, I became more convinced than ever that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are basically one and the same. If you look at the corporations that fund their campaigns, that contribute to their campaigns, sometimes it's the same corporation contributing to both sides in the same race, such as PG&E. You know, what is PG&E doing? You know, funding these campaigns. What is like Koch brothers? You know, the famous, you know, quasi-fascist supporters of Donald Trump doing funding the campaign of Lina Gonzalez, you know, darling liberal progressive Democrat. You know, it's if that isn't sufficient evidence that points to the parties being the same thing, you know, two sides of the same fucking coin, you know, I want my own coin, you know. So I'm proud to say that as of yesterday, I changed, other than the significant event of filing my retirement paperwork, I also changed my registration. I am now registered California National Party. I have to say that I am not entirely in agreement with the entire platform. As I was mentioning to Sean from the very first time we met, this issue of independence is a little bit foreign to me. But still, you know, I find that you know, I very much appreciate the California National Party supporting my campaign, and I'm in agreement with the platform as deals with fair housing for all, healthcare, and political representation. So those are the things that I mainly agree with, and you know, it's very difficult to run a campaign as no party preference, even though if no party preference was a party, it would be the largest party in the U.S. Currently, there are about 40% of voters registered as no party preference versus 30%, approximately 30% Democrats and 30% Republicans. So that's what the California National Party has to do, is to capture that 40% of voters that have been disenfranchised by the two sides of the same coin. So I didn't get asked to talk about any of that stuff, sorry. I got asked to talk about my campaign. So my campaign was a grassroots campaign, and because of my few years of as a community advocate in Long Beach, it was very clear that the status quo was afraid of my campaign. They did everything in their power to squash it from the beginning. I was fighting against an incumbent with name recognition, with part of a 16-year dynasty. His wife served 2 terms, and now he served 2 terms. So just in terms of name recognition, it's tough. Even though a lot of people in my district, particularly in my neighborhood, knew me because of my, life there and my activism. But on top of that was, the money issue. I raised a little over $9,000 for my campaign. The incumbent had well over 100,000, including some of the independent expenditures by unions and by the Democratic Party that I still haven't wrapped my hands around. But On top of that, there was opposition from the press in terms of like almost a total blackout. The press covered almost all the opposition candidates, but not one article mentioned me. They mentioned me just sort of as a person who is opposing the incumbent, the Democrat, long-time Democrat, labor leader, blah, 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 et cetera. The incumbent, but not once did my name appear in the press. When I filed my papers, the city attorney opposed my candidate designation on rules that they made up. In fact, they made up along with a firm called Best and Krieger. It's a firm of a law firm that assists many cities around the Southland, I think, maybe even beyond. But they do all the nasty work that the city attorneys don't want to do. So they made up rules for why I couldn't have my ballot designation, and they just made them up on the spot. But they wouldn't even let me look at the rules, citing attorney-client privilege, so I couldn't even fight my designation. At that time, I was a member of the Democratic Socialists. I had been a member for a couple of years. They, in spite of being a lifelong socialist, they claimed that I belonged to a couple of right-wing groups, which they never cleared up what those right-wing groups are. I mean, if you think right-wing groups, you would think I was a member of the Nazis, the KKK. What are right-wing groups? I mean, people think the worst when they say somebody is a member of a right-wing group, and yet somehow they claim that I was a member of right-wing groups. They claimed that I had endorsed somebody in a campaign for mayor that didn't even exist. I mean, they told me, it's like very Kafka, The Democratic Party came out and actually put out hit pieces against me, mailers claiming that I had called President Biden a rapist and other things that they just pulled out of thin air. The councilman's wife filed frivolous claims with the FPPC, meaning that I had to spend time and resources fighting that. Anyway, it just sort of went on and on. It was like swimming upstream, and it was basically a solo campaign with help from Rodolfo sitting right there, and a couple of other volunteers, and very little money. And despite having been outspent something like 12-1, I still managed a decent showing, a little over 30% of the vote versus the incumbent's 58%. Unfortunately, if there was no runoff, which would have given me another opportunity, because he did exceed 50% of the vote. But it was clear that that they were going all out to defeat my campaign. I'm going to try again, if not directly myself, supporting another candidate. But I think I learned a few lessons in this campaign. We don't need we will never, as CMP or no party preference candidates, can never make the same amount of money that one of the corporate parties will raise. We will always be outspent 10-1 or 100-1 or 1,000-1. So there have to be other means. but they all require people power to back us up. They require a party. I would never do this again solo. If I do it again, I hope to count on the CNP to back me. And if it's another candidate that I'm supporting, I will push them towards doing it along with the party, because obviously I'm not going to support anyone who doesn't believe in my core values, which are similar to your core values, to our core values. You know, and one of the other lessons that I learned was that, you know, as growing up as a socialist, you know, the first words out of my mouth would be something like, you know, death to capitalism, you know, or defund the police, you know, or fuck the police or whatever. But you know, that's not really going to get us anywhere. And in this campaign, I managed to convince a lot of people. Since I had no party affiliation, I was approaching everyone: Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and it was I managed to convince almost everyone that I spoke with, regardless of what party or whether they were liberal or conservative, that defunding the police made sense. I didn't use defund the police. I used other words, such as, you know, we need to be fiscally responsible with how we spend our money. It's more fiscally responsible to spend money on public safety on issues that actually resolve crime, as opposed to fight crime after it has happened. And so using words like that, I managed to you know, Republicans, Democrats, it didn't matter. You know, so it's a matter of how you say things, as much as what you know, without changing the actual meaning. But so anyway, I think I already talked for too long, but thank you very much for having invited me, and I hope to be an active member of the CNP, and I hope to support other campaigns coming up. Thank you.
So, next up is, again, I think